This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to the May 12th edition of Global Engagement. I'm Patrick Ryan.
And I'm Dick Bowers.
Today we're going to talk about the top 5 topics in the news from the past week. First, let me remind you that you can find all of the Tennessee World Affairs Council webinars and podcasts and all of our digital material on our website. That's tnwac.org. And we invite you to take a look at those items that we produce as part of our digital program. They include this show, Global Engagement, that Ambassador Bowers and I do every Tuesday at 2 p.m., a Global Dialogue speakers program, and Global Nashville with Carl Dean. Those alternate on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. We've recently started putting out information about the digital productions of other World Affairs Councils in a weekly newsletter called Virtual Globe. So we invite you to become a subscriber to the TNWAC newsletter. Just go to the website and you can sign up for that. Okay, let's see. And let me also mention that every Monday at 10 a.m. you can get the What in the World weekly quiz. It's a challenging summation of what's been going on in the previous week's news. Ambassador Bowers, you are a regular quiz taker and you do pretty darn well.
I am a regular quiz taker, and sometimes you put some ringers in there that, where do you get this? But most of the time I'm up in the 70-day, 80, 90 percentile. But the key here is you can't use Google. So nope. you either know it or you don't know it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So that's every Monday. You can subscribe. Go to the tnwac.org news website and get the newsletter. And every Monday at 10 a.m. you'll have the quiz. And just a reminder, if you want to be eligible for the prize that goes along with the quiz, you should become a member of the World Affairs Council. Okay, Dick, do you want to run us through what we're going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to be drilling down on the following 5 topics that are in the news. And of course, the number one event kind of thing is the COVID news. And so we'll talk about some numbers and figures and what's going on and particularly what's COVID doing in other parts of the world in Davidson County. Second topic is going to be Russia and election interference. And we're going to just basically give some background and context to this because this has been going on for some time. And there was a lot of concern as to whether it's over, and evidently it's not, because the third thing we're going to talk about is the current developments of Russia and election interference. Fourth topic is China-U.S. relations, and that's an ongoing, evolving story. Lots of interesting things going on. And then finally, middle powers and diplomacy. There's some interesting developments going on, primarily led by Australia, where middle powers, i.e. not great powers like China and the United States, not developing powers, but middle powers are starting to take initiatives in the international arena, which is changing the scope of how diplomacy is done around the world and what's going on. So those are the first 5. COVID news is the first snapshot. Have you got some data for us, Pat?
Yeah, let's take a look at what has been happening on that front for the last week. And we do have some numbers here. Every week we take a look at the global statistics, and like most other places that people turn to news, Dick, when we look for world news, it's consumed with what's going on in the pandemic crisis, as it should be. This is quite a spectacular event.
Changing the world and changing our lives.
So every week we run through the numbers, and In this week's summation, we've jumped from 3.6 million cases globally to 4.3 million, and the deaths have jumped up from 255,000 to 289,000. And as you can see, the United States is still at the top of the list for total cases. Russia.
How do you feel about the accuracy of the data?
Well, yeah, that's a question we have to keep in mind. There's a lot of skepticism over some of the reporting, especially the numbers from China. And I was going to make a note that that 82,000 probably is not an accurate number, but that's a good question. Well, the data sources are the individual countries, and they may or may not want to or be able to get their arms around what all the numbers are. But this is a good snapshot to see what's going on with some of these countries and where the United States ranks in the cases. The CDC, which I think is pretty good information, has the U.S. Crossing the 80,000 mark for deaths as a result of COVID-19. And you can see in the two last week, the smaller map, and this week, that the reporting numbers, the darkest color last week was 25,000 or more, and this week it's now 40,000 or more. So California, for example, and Illinois, you can see that the upper Midwest, the numbers are going up. We're looking at reopening things, but we have to be cautious as to what the.
So how do you feel about the reopening? We're Davidson County, where you and I are sitting right now, Nashville. They're opening back up to a certain extent.
Right.
And I am fearful that this is going to lead to another spike, and rather than dampening down and getting the trade-off between trying to get back to economic normal while at the same time trying to maintain the necessary social distancing to flatten out these curves. I'm not sure we've got that right yet.
No, I agree, and I don't think anybody's making the argument that the opening will not see an increase in the number of infections. It's kind of dismaying when you see some of the collections of people. The other day, there was a picture that went viral, at least in our community, of a gathering at a restaurant or a bar or someplace in Franklin. And everybody was just huddled together, no masks, no social distancing. So yeah, you're right. I think the reopening is going to see a spike. All right, so that's the numbers on COVID, and we're going to take a snapshot of just a couple of things going on.
How about if I jump in with the U.S.-Mexico story?
Okay.
There are a whole lot of Americans that are down in Mexico, both gringos, i.e. people who are not of Mexican heritage, who have gone down there to retire, as well as a number of dual citizens. They hold Mexican passports as well as U.S. passports. And there is some growing concern in the United States that if this COVID takes off more rapidly in Mexico, a lot of these American passport holders will head north. And that could have a very adverse impact on the health systems, especially in the border area states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and maybe California. So that's something to keep our eye on as this thing evolves.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has been in the news a lot. And one of the items in the news this past week talked about the WHO being optimistic that there were some treatments that appeared to be limiting the effects of COVID-19 disease. And they're focusing on 4 or 5 of the most promising ones. And I think remdesivir was among those 4 or 5 that they're looking at. Also, the WHO also said that there are more than 100 potential COVID-19 vaccines being developed, including several that are in clinical trials. So that's hopeful. But they did say that that a vaccine would take at least 12 months to deploy. So that's a long process, but it's good that there are that many trials going on.
sort of the tail end of that story, Pat, once a vaccine is developed, and I'm confident that given the state of science in the world, it will happen, the whole production cycle, how much vaccine do you ramp up, how fast, and who gets it? And who doesn't get it, because the distribution issue is going to be out there. But that said, in the United Kingdom, COVID deaths topped 38,000 as of early May, by far the worst in all of Europe. And that's raising questions about Prime Minister Boris Johnson's handling of the corona crisis. The United Kingdom official death toll rose to 38,289 as of May 3rd, nearly 6,000 more deaths in a 1 week period. So Johnson has set out a gradual plan now to get Britain back to work, including advice on wearing homemade face coverings and things of that sort. But there's a lot of confusion, it seems, as to how this message is rolling out, and they need to be doing a better job. So even after adjusting for population, Britain still ranks among the countries worst affected by the pandemic, in a list that includes Belgium, Spain, and Italy in Europe.
Yeah, there's also an increase in the infection rate in Russia, and you know, as this thing was developing, Russia wasn't much in the news, Dick, as we were looking at the numbers around the world go up, and everybody was wondering what was going on, and some of that might have, you know, you mentioned the reporting of numbers, and there were skeptics that Russia might not be reporting what their numbers, but we now are seeing more data from Russia, and they are now the second highest infections in the world with 232,000, and they're behind only the United States, which is over 1 million cases of COVID-19. Putin, however, despite the surge in infections, has called for a lift of the nationwide restrictions that has seen Russians staying at home, much as we've done here. But an opposition leader is blaming Putin with putting the onus on regional governors to take the heat off himself as far as prescribing what the restrictions should be. And that sort of mimics a tactic we've seen in other countries. Brazil in particular, Bolsonaro didn't want people to stay at home, and he put the responsibility on regional governors there.
Do you think that's happening here in the United States?
Well, I was going to say, some would say that that the federal government is also giving sway to governors, and the political implication is to wash their hands.
I'm not responsible, right? Give it somebody else. Hey, speaking of Russia, you and Marieta did a wonderful job last week. The lovely.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Marieta Velikova. So
I was going to mention that Professor Marieta Velikova from Belmont University and a member of our Tennessee World Affairs Council board sat in for my colleague Ambassador Bowers, and did a fantastic job talking about what's going on.
You'll have to come back and give me more time off.
Well, maybe we'll just have a third seat here.
Well, anyway, you could do that too, and that kind of loosen things up. Anyway,
okay.
Speaking of Russia.
Russia.
You want to start us off on that, or you want me to try?
Sure. No. Well, I'll take a crack at topic 2, Russian interference. Let me first mention before we get into this, and we're going to divide this into 2 topics: one, background and context, and then we're going to talk about what's going on now in terms of Russia and information warfare and cyber activities aimed at influencing the 2020 election. Last October, I had the opportunity to interview Malcolm Nance for our podcast, Global Tennessee. And Malcolm is a former retired Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer who was a cryptologist. And Ambassador Bowers, your resume includes time as a cryptologist working in Berlin.
Yeah.
You were peeking in on the Russians at the time?
Peeking in on the Russian radios. It was a long time ago, like about 50 years ago now, right?
Yeah.
No, 60 years ago. Gosh.
Well, Malcolm Nance was a Navy senior chief, and then after he retired, he got involved in consulting on terrorism, counterterrorism. Was very active. He served in Iraq, helping the effort there. So he's a pretty smart guy. And a
Yep.
couple of years ago, before the 2016 election, he got interested in cyber warfare activities and basically wrote the book on what was going on in the 2016 campaign against the United States election. So if you visit Amazon, look for Malcolm Nance, and you can take a look at what
Well,
he's.
you did a podcast with him, Pat, and it was an excellent podcast.
Well,
right?
thank you very much. I was just going to dive into that just a little bit more.
Okay.
I would suggest that people take a look at the podcast, our episode 33 in the Global Tennessee podcast, and those are available on our website or at soundcloud.com/TNWAC. And you'll learn that Malcolm, we talked for over an hour, which for podcasts is probably beyond the conventional wisdom, but
No, it's worth every minute of it. He's a smart cookie.
the guy is that knowledgeable. So you'll learn in deep detail from Malcolm what the tactics and techniques that are being employed by Russia in their cyber information campaigns. So let's turn to the timeline, Dick. We're going to go through some of the warnings and alerts that were issued, starting with a statement in October 2016. A month before the election, the last presidential election, there was a joint statement from the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on the subject of election security. And that was, I believe, Secretary Jay Johnson and not Coates. Yeah, was it Daniel Coates? No, he was brought in by Trump. Later. We'll get back to you on that one. But Secretary Jay Johnson of Homeland Security and the ODNI issued the statement.
Brennan, National Security.
No, he was CIA.
Okay.
While I'm talking, you can Google it. Good to have a team working here. But the October statement basically said that they were the intelligence community, which is comprised with 17 different agencies in the U.S. government, primarily the CIA and the NSA and the DIA get together in the State Department on these sorts of statements, and they concluded that they were confident the Russian government had directed compromises of U.S. persons and institutions, and that the thefts and disclosures were intended to impact the U.S. election. There was some indication that the Russians were involved in looking at systems related to local election control, but no indication that they had penetrated any of that. So following that, in January, before President Trump was sworn in, but after he was elected, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released another statement in which he concluded that Putin had in fact ordered the cyber and information warfare attack, and that it was intended to influence the campaign in the favor of President Trump.
James Clapper.
That's
James
right.
Clapper was the Director of National Intelligence in 2016.
That's right. Very good. Thank you. I don't know how I forgot that. I worked for him at the Defense Intelligence Agency back in the day. Okay, so the January statement again pointed to Russia, pointed directly to Putin, and said that the effort was to influence the U.S. elections. So after that, there was another statement. It was called the Mueller Report. And you may remember, we don't want to get too involved in politics here, but the Mueller Report, Volume 1, investigated the extent of Russian interference in the 2016 elections, and they concluded, or Mr. Mueller concluded that the Russian interference was sweeping and systemic, that the major attacks were through social media, information warfare, and Dick, information warfare has been a tactic for millennia. People have tried to influence adversaries through information war techniques.
Pat, let me interrupt for a second. I think on the slide there's a typo in there. The Mueller report, didn't that come out in 2019?
Yes, that is a typo. Thank you for catching that.
Sorry.
No.
I want our audience to get false information here. No fake news on this program.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have to fix that typo. Good catch, Ambassador Bowers. Okay, so then the next report, and this is filling out the background and the timeline, was again. Well, that's the Mueller report again. Let's get to the right slide. No. Okay. Well, we'll pop out of the slides, but the next report was the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and that was the United States Senate. And this was a bipartisan report. It was led by a Republican chairman and a Democrat ranking member, and they concluded in last August that the St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency used social media to conduct an information warfare campaign designed to spread disinformation and societal division in the United States. They concluded that this was at the behest and run by the Russian government, directed by Mr. Putin. And by late August 2016, an official in the office of the Director of National Intelligence had already concluded that the Russians had attempted to intrude in all 50 states in the country based on the extent of their activity. He told the committee that in his professional judgment, they have to work under the assumption that they've tried to go everywhere because they're, quote, thorough, competent, and good. So that was what was going on.
I don't know if I'd agree they're good. They're capable, competent, but good, I don't know. How good. They kind of want a different world than I and my colleagues, I think, who believe in democracy want to kind of have. So.
Well, yeah, I don't think that was good versus evil. I think that was
good at it.
They're good at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt, Pat, that they're up to this, and there are others that are up to it as well. I mean, it's not the Russians are the primary motivators of this kind of thing, but there are other actors in the world that are using it, and it's a wild west out there on the web. What you do and how you do it, whose data, who can control what. I think there'll be a lot of stuff coming up. So. Oh,
sure. Yeah, no, we'll definitely make the point that this is not only the Russians trying to interfere with our elections. There are many other countries out there that are very capable in cyber warfare and information warfare. And we should probably separate the two, that there are people doing things through computer hacking and getting into networks and so forth. And then there's information warfare, disinformation, sowing discord. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what's coming up here. So this is topic 3, current developments in the Russian election interference. And we took a look at a couple of articles that should be of interest to you. In February of this year, there was a report that, and this wasn't just the Washington Post, this was in all the papers, that a senior intelligence official told lawmakers that Russia wants to see Trump reelected. So this was an appearance before Congress by an official named Shelby Pearson, and she was briefing Congress, and she mentioned that the intelligence community had concluded that Putin had developed a preference for Trump. And when this made the news that the intelligence community had made that statement, President Trump was angry then with Joseph McGuire, who was the acting director of national intelligence. And a couple days later, he was no longer in that job. So there's some political sensitivity to these reports about Russia's preference for President Trump, at least as far as the 2016 election. And Dick, do you want to talk a little bit about the article in March, Suzanne Spalding?
Okay. So Suzanne Spalding's a Washington Post, and she was in the past a senior advisor of Homeland Security and international security programs. Well, and she writes that the November election is just around the corner, and it's clear the Russian government continues to wage an assault on our election processes. But this has time, and you got patience, so finger pointing doesn't help. She said, instead, we've got to get our act together. And this, in my mind, Pat, I kind of cut this into two different ways in which they interfere. One is by using social media to create realities that are not real, either using bots to say something happened when it didn't, snowflakes, various kinds of things. And the other is to figure out a way to actually go in and mess with voter rolls, mess with voting machines and things of that sort. So both of these things are an issue. Anyway, Suzanne Spalding is worried that this is going on now, and basically saying that this has never really stopped since the last elections. And the troll farms and the hackers and the advertising campaigns just keep on keeping on. And the Russians no longer need to post during Russian workdays, so they can get it on whenever they want to get it on.
Yeah, so, I think it's important. One of the important elements of this article, and I would recommend this. It's a March article in the Washington Post. It's an opinion piece, but it's from the analytical assessment perspective of somebody who's worked in these issues. And she suggests that Putin's objectives they go beyond elections and the same basic narrative. Democracy is corrupt, hypocritical, and chaotic, and that the goal is to convince people not to desire Western-style democracy. And Putin wants to weaken us by exploiting and exacerbating divisions and distrust. And, you know, Dick, now in America is certainly a time to capitalize on the divisions that we have, left, right, red, blue, et cetera. So he's got fertile ground to go after our system, and what he's doing is sowing distrust, and it makes it harder to galvanize and sustain public support for actions that might prevent Russia from acting in ways that undermine U.S. interest and security.
Yeah, they're not just doing it to us, Pat. They're doing it in many other parts of the world, particularly in Europe.
Yeah.
They basically, early on in the past, they shut down Estonia, the entire net for a while. So the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, have probably now got some of the best cyber defenses that are out there, because they have been dealing on the front lines with the Russian hackers for such a long time. Yeah. And Russia also has RT, which is Russia Today. You know, they're able to broadcast in the United States and then subtly push their propaganda and their idea of doing things. And part of the
and
desire,
Sputnik.
And Sputnik, yeah. Part of the desire, I think, on Putin's side is to cause doubt on our basic institutions, such as you can't really trust the courts. You know, this is all fixed. Elections are fake. You know, you can't really trust that when you go to vote, your vote's going to count. All of this has a pernicious effect on the psyche of the American body politic.
Right, and he's gone after the courts and the media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's a lot of it is in plain sight, as you mentioned, the propaganda elements of the Russian government, Sputnik and RT. And a lot of it is people have been hired to act on social media. Russian bots are replicating attacks. In 2016, they sought to sow division between the races. So we have to be on guard for this. And
I think the bottom line is, as you kind of put it, our democracy is under attack, and what are we going to do about it?
right.
How do we maintain our liberty and our freedom and our rule of law and our basic institutions and all the things of which Americans are proud, and at the same time fight back against this new threat that's out there that's really coming at us? So.
Well, Spalding concluded that Americans must understand what Putin hopes to achieve. It's not just about which candidate Russia may support, that all of democracy is under attack by the Russian government. And as you mentioned, Dick, it's not just the Russians, but we must all fight to defend it, as Spalding says, to hold our institutions accountable and believe in our power to bring about change. Make sure you vote. Know there may be disruptions and claims of corruption. Insist on an impartial process, and accept the outcome of elections. So we have to be smart about our democracy and protect it.
Well, to link it back into the COVID-19 issue, that virus is still going to be here when we have our election. And I was heartened to see, I got in the mail here in Davidson County from the election board that they're urging people to request absentee ballots so that they don't have to go into the polling station and risk infection. So we've got a long way to go as to getting prepared and how we across the country, because elections are basically decentralized and it's the county election official that has to run the gears and the machinery. But it's going to be a difficult and interesting time.
For sure. Well, let's turn to topic 4, China-U.S. relations. It's an election year. We have a global pandemic. What could go wrong? Well,
what could go right?
Who was it? Pogo? We've met the enemy, and he is us. Something like that.
Well, you had a webcast on this last week, right? When I was not available.
We did. Our evening program, the Global Dialogue, was a conversation with 2 specialists on China. Jeremy Goldkorn, who's the editor-in-chief of a terrific website called supchina.com. That's supchina.com. Take a look just as another resource on China. Jeremy lived in China and worked in the media there and other adventures. Dick, I don't know if you knew this about Jeremy. He rode a bicycle from Peshawar in northern Pakistan, up into the Himalayas.
Wow.
Over 1,000 miles on a bicycle through that terrain. So
it's an adventure. That's my kind of guy.
Yeah. Well, people probably don't know about you that you've. What's the club? What's the club? Every top peak in the U.S. 50.
It's called High Pointers.
High Pointers.
Yeah, every state has a highest point, and your goal is to get to them. And some of them, like Florida and Delaware, they're pretty easy to get to. Others, like Alaska and Montana, you got to work on those.
I'll start with Florida, thanks.
But you do get to see the United States. You get out there, just set yourself a goal. I'm going to get to the highest point of every state, and then you can start working on continents.
Okay.
Amazing what you can do. Anyway, back to China.
So Jeremy is an expert on China, and you should check out his website, supchina.com. He's also co-host of a podcast called Sinica, Sinica. So check those out. And please take a look at the webinar that we did with Jeremy and John Scanapieko. John is an attorney at Baker Donaldson. He's chief of their global business section. He's also a member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council board. The two of them really, it was a tour de force in discussing what's going on in China. So that was our webcast, our webinar from last week. And you can find that and all of our webinars on our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/TNWAC. So take a look through some of those. especially that one on China was terrific.
It's good. You know, Pat, in the international arena, sometimes when there's a natural disaster or a calamity or some horrible thing happens in the world, it brings nations together. They tend to realize, well, we're not in this alone. We ought to work together. Let's see if we can find common cause. In coronavirus, it seems that what's happening is China and the United States are spiraling down into an even more acrimonious kind of relationship.
Right.
And our president is basically taken to personalizing the virus by calling it the China virus. The Chinese have taken umbrage to that. A lot of my Asian friends in the United States are concerned that they're being targeted with sort of subtle racism. But the United States and China are having a difficult time. What is clear is that the virus did seem to originate in China. What is not clear is, did it come out of one of these wet markets where live animals were being sold? Or is there any truth to the assertion made by members of the Trump administration that it was created in a Chinese laboratory and it got inadvertently released? Now, my reading of most everybody around the world and watching reputable sources, the idea of that it was created is being debunked. And science has the capability to look into the genetic makeup of the virus and to see whether it seems to be a natural or a synthetic one. So, but
Yeah,
it's really causing trouble between us and the Chinese right now, and we're on a downward spiral.
Yeah, as far as the virus, Dick, I think a lot of that was set aside. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence did release a report that the virus, that they agreed with the consensus of scientists that the virus was not man-made, that it was a naturally occurring. But that left open the possibility and the charges from Secretary of State Pompeo that it may have come from the Wuhan Virology Institute and been accidentally released through infection.
Well, and the Chinese have also kind of engaged in a little bit of their own mudslinging. There were some reports with some senior Chinese officials that the United States Army had introduced the virus, that we had snuck it in over there somehow. So
right. Well, the whole episode, it's actually put the WHO kind of in the middle of the battle back and forth. And there's been some criticism of the WHO, and I think there'll probably be a congressional look into what's going on in that case. But the Trump administration has subsequently defunded the aid that was going to the WHO. And frankly, Dick, I'm not sure. Well, I'm pretty sure that now is not the time to pull the plug on the WHO as far as supporting the work that it's doing. There are countries around the world that don't have a center for disease control. They have the WHO, so
exactly
they perform an invaluable function in countries that are dealing with COVID that don't have other resources. But let's take a look, if we can, Dick, at what some polling results showed about U.S. views on China. And this is from a Pew study that was done in March of 2020, from the beginning to the end of the month. So people obviously, and it didn't start in, as a result of the pandemic. The trend has been for some time that Americans were increasingly negative about China. And as you can see in this slide, the numbers unfavorable climbed to 66, and favorable is bottomed out at 26% of those surveyed. Again, this was March 3 to 29. So the coronavirus was certainly a factor, but clearly this didn't just start as a result of that. You can see here that Americans see China as a major threat. The numbers are expanding over the last couple of years, and there's been a lot of conversation about national security issues, the South China Sea, the claims about Taiwan, conflict with Japan over island claims, the growing size of the Chinese military. So that's definitely on people's minds as well. And here's a indication of what Americans say that the U.S. is compared to China in terms of the leading military power. 83% of Americans see the United States as the leading military power, and 6% say it's China. And the percentage who say it is better for the world if this or that is the world's leading power, and 91% of Americans believe that China is not positioned to be in that role.
Pat, is that worldwide data, or is that just United States?
These are Americans. A survey of U.S. adults conducted in March. Americans see the U.S. as a global leader, and they have major doubts about China. 71% have no confidence in President Xi Jinping. 66%, as shown on that first graph, have unfavorable views of China, and 62% believe China is a major threat. Its power and influence pose a threat. So some interesting metrics to consider as we understand better what is going on in the relationship with China. I think some of this started to come to a head, Dick, with the trade and the tariffs, and it was a reaction to economic issues as much as national security issues. Although national security is a component of that, but we do have to look at the economics of what's going on between the United States and China.
Well, the economics is part of the whole national security picture. It's not just how many guns or tanks or ships do you have. It's the entire panoply of your ability to project power and project your ideals in the world. And the United States has, for the last several years, been backing off being the leader that it had been since the Second World War. And so there was a very interesting article in the New York Times, was it yesterday or today, about how the middle powers are taking on the responsibility to try to make the world work a little bit better. And by middle power, we mean not a superpower and not a developing world power, but the middle powers like Australia. And Australia has started its own kind of diplomatic initiative, working with other countries, and in particular, many European countries have got on. And they're trying to build a new kind of alliance by first sort of trying to figure out what went wrong in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
So they have asked that the WHO undertake a strategic long-range study, exactly what happened. How did this virus get going, and how did it get out of the bag, so to speak? And they've initiated other countries working on it. They started by themselves, and now many European powers are on board. And I think this has got some real oomph behind it in the long run. It's going to be interesting to see these middle powers are supporting the institutions, like the UN and the World Health Organization and various others. And they have called that in for investigation into Beijing. Beijing is very upset with that, and they don't think that they should be investigated. But part of the issue is, if the United States is not going to lead, who can they rely on? So they got to do it themselves.
Yeah, I think this could be an interesting trend in the global landscape of institutions and participation. I believe Australia, I know they're in the G20. They're not a G7 nation.
No, they're G20 nation, I believe.
Yeah, and the Europeans some of them are represented in the G7 and many more in the G20. But I think this could be a trend, as we do see China emerging with kind of a different face than it had over the last decade, in terms of how it deals with with its international responsibility.
Well, I mean, traditionally, Australia has been one of our strongest allies, and for the last 7 decades, after the, during
Sure.
the Second World War and thereafter, America was the place to turn if there was a problem in the East. And the United States was the defender of transparency and cooperation and democracy and liberal economics and all those kinds of things. And now the Australians are beginning to wonder, can we rely on the United States anymore? Maybe we got to figure out some other ways of doing things in the world. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this.
Yeah. Well, again, I think a new trend, and you're right, we'll have to keep our eye on connections between the middle powers.
Yeah, and I'm just, I'm thinking of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which basically was designed by the United States to get us closer relationships with the countries of Asia, and to have them and us all on the same sheet of music relative to how we're going to do trade and how we're going to do protection of workers and all those kinds of things. We pulled out of that unilaterally when President Trump took office. And 11 of the countries that were part of that have now formed their own Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
And we're not part of that. So it's kind of a sad thing in my point of view that we're pulling back, because we are in the world and have to be of the world, and we had the capacity to lead the world, and we ought to start doing that. Now that's my editorial comment for today there, Mr. Ryan.
Well, we're here to comment and provide analysis and assessments of what's going on in the news, and I think that's a pretty fair point, that America's traditional role as a leader in world affairs is currently starting to erode to a significant extent.
Yeah, well, I mean, just going back to this COVID-19 thing. Traditionally, if something like this had happened, America would have been the leader to mobilize the world in the response. And that didn't happen this time. And so the result is nobody stepped up and became the leader of that kind of a thing. So we have to decide what our role is in the world, and whether we want to be the leader, or we want to be a follower, or we just want to try to build walls instead of, moats around whatever we can.
Yeah, well, we've had conversations about the diminishment of institutions like NATO. The president of France has said NATO is dead. The chancellor of Germany has said that Europe must go its own way. After the pandemic, the United States cut funding to the WHO. We didn't participate in the conversation about how to support funding for vaccine development through the WHO. So we may be, if a vaccine is developed outside of the United States, we may find ourselves knocking at the door trying to participate in the.
Can we have some of that, please?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's a team game. If you want to play, you got to take the field.
There you go. We got any questions this week, Pat?
Well, we have some attendees in the room there, and I do see a question just popped in. Campbell Lehman, our academic World Quest student, who is a faithful follower of Ambassador Dick Bowers in our webinars here. She asks, do you think that China will release more accurate data during the second wave of COVID than they did during the first wave? Well, I think that a second wave of COVID-19 may emerge from outside of China, and I think it's going to be in a place where, like Italy or Korea, or someplace where they had an outbreak and it spread. Well, Iran was another epicenter of spread.
Brazil.
So I don't think a second wave of COVID-19 will emanate from the same place that the first one did. And I think the international community is on the lookout for breakouts and mutations. So it's going to be an international play, in my understanding of how they track down these pandemic outbreaks. What do you think, Dick?
Well, one of the casualties in this whole thing has been the truth. I mean, when you have a pandemic of this sort, one of the first things you try to establish if you're going to be the leader in this is trust and truth. And you always tell the truth. You don't politicize things. You don't try to cover stuff up. Because if you lose the confidence and the trust of the people you're trying to lead, you're not going to go where you want to go. So my sense is the Chinese are going to use their political power and their ability to control the media so that they maximize their political leverage on this. And this is what they've always done. So in the West, I would hope we don't do that. I would hope that we speak truth to power and let the science drive us where we need to go.
Sure. Any more questions from our attendees? We will be wrapping up here shortly. Dick, any other observations on what's going on in the world besides our 5 topics? COVID seems to be dominating the news. But,
yes, I was thinking about how if I had been a smart guy, I would have invested a lot differently 6 months ago. So
Zoom stock?
In particular, yes, particularly in Netflix. I would imagine that Netflix is getting a lot of good things. And one of the things basically that I like about Netflix has a fair number of international programs. So you can watch Korean soap operas. Right now, I'm in the middle of the Siege of Constantinople, which is takes you back to the 1400s and things of that sort in the Ottoman Empire. So there's a lot of things to pick and choose from, and I would just urge you to kind of pick the good stuff. Right?
Well, I'll second that. There's a wealth of options of things that can occupy our time. I'll mention again the virtual globe email that we put out every Monday, which lists the programs that are being put on by World Affairs Councils around the country. Many of them are free. Some of them ask for a minor donation for their World Affairs Council. And I will pitch our World Affairs Council a little bit here. For those of you who are not members, please consider becoming a member. If you're not ready for a membership, perhaps you could make a donation. We do have a text to give on your phone. If you text give and then the number of whatever your gift would be to 844-959-2934, we would appreciate your support to make programs like this happen. So Dick,
another week, Pat.
Another week. We're under the time limit.
I am sorry I didn't bring the pulchritude and the wonderful visual presence that Marieta brought, but
no, you were just fine.
We talked good. All the best to you. Have a good week, and God willing, we'll see you next Tuesday.
Yes, everybody be safe, and look for the webcast tonight at 7 p.m. with Carl Dean. He'll be talking with Doug Krulin, the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Nashville Airport Authority. They are the folks who run BNA. And if you haven't been out to BNA, well, probably not during the pandemic, but prior to, you would have seen quite a lot of working going on there. It's a BNA Vision, several-year program to increase the capacity and the ability of BNA to serve as a international gateway for Nashville. So that should be a terrific webinar tonight at 7 p.m. If you can't catch it tonight live, where you can have your questions answered, then you can catch it on youtube.com/TNWAC. So that's it for me. Thanks, Ambassador Bowers.
Thank you.
You be safe. Hopefully your power will stay on this week.
Yeah, I didn't like not having power for 4 days. So
okay, well, hang in there. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.